The US dollar has been the dominant global currency for nearly a century. This has given the United States a lot of political and economic power, including what's known as its exorbitant privilege. The US can run massive trade deficits, and workers in other countries have to work hard producing goods and services that they export to the US. And all the US has to do to import that is simply print the US dollar. And whereas most countries would face very significant inflation if they were to run these enormous deficits over time, the US doesn't have as high inflation because there is global demand for the US dollar. This is the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar, and this has benefited economic elites in the US. However, increasingly, especially in the 21st century, the US government has been abusing this exorbitant privilege and turning the dollar into a geopolitical weapon. The US has imposed unilateral sanctions on 1/3 of all countries on Earth, and that includes 60% of low-income nations. This is a form of economic warfare. These sanctions violate international law because they do not have the support of the United Nations. Yet the US has used its control over the global reserve currency in order to try to lock countries out of the international financial system, which is largely dominated by the US. This has led to growing resistance and a worldwide movement of countries pushing for de-dollarization, seeking alternatives to the US dollar. Many countries in the global south that were previously colonized by the Western powers have joined together in new organizations, the most famous of which is BRICS, founded by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And these global south countries are de-dollarizing, creating alternatives to the US dollar. They are trading with each other in local currencies. There are even discussions of potentially creating a new global reserve currency to replace the US dollar. Now, that would be a complicated process that would take many years to develop, but there is more and more discussion of it happening around the world today. And a country that has been very important in the global movement for de-dollarization is Iran. Iran has been selling more and more of its oil and gas not in US dollars, but in other currencies, in particular the Chinese currency, the renminbi or yuan. And this has really frightened the United States, which is trying to maintain the global dominance of the US dollar. And for decades, the US government has tried to force major oil producers only to sell their oil in US dollars. This is especially the case for the Persian Gulf monarchies like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, because these countries export a lot of oil and gas, which means they make a lot of foreign currency, in particular US dollars, because the US imposed a petrodollar system on the region in the 1970s, forcing these countries to sell their oil and gas in dollars, which maintains global demand for the US dollar. However, in recent years, the Persian Gulf countries have been moving closer and closer to China, which is their largest trading partner. And even Saudi Arabia is now talking about selling its oil in China's currency, the renminbi or yuan, which would be a major blow to the global dominance of the US dollar. Even these longtime US allies see that the dollar has been politicized, and they're afraid that they could be the next countries to be targeted by the US with sanctions. Because until recently, most of the countries that were trying to challenge the US dollar were those that have been targeted by the US for intervention and regime change in war. The people of Iran have suffered under illegal US sanctions for decades, ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Just like how ever since the people of Cuba carried out a revolution against a US-backed right-wing dictator in 1959, the US has tried to suffocate the Cuban economy with a blockade, an embargo that violates international law. And every single year at the United Nations General Assembly, almost every country on earth, consistently 98% of UN member states vote against this illegal US blockade, and yet it continues. So Cuba and Iran are both countries that have suffered under political war waged by the US for many decades. This is known as hybrid war, where the US wages many different kinds of indirect war, including political war, economic war, technological war, information war. And under US President Donald Trump, it has escalated into a conventional military war, with the US and Israel directly bombing Iran on its territory in violation of its sovereignty. But this did not all start with Donald Trump. This goes back many decades, and we've seen that regardless of who the US president is, whether or not they're a Republican or a Democrat, they've been carrying out these very aggressive policies against Iran. In fact, this goes back even before the Iranian Revolution. In 1953, the CIA backed a coup that overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and the US put in power the notorious Shah, the king. He was a brutal dictator who governed with an iron fist from 1953 until the revolution in 1979. And one of the main reasons for this Western-backed coup in Iran in 1953 was because Mohammad Mossadegh, the elected prime minister, was a left-wing nationalist, and he nationalized the oil reserves in Iran. He kicked out US and British oil corporations and said that the oil of Iran belonged to the Iranian people, and he wanted to use Iran's natural resources to develop the country. And this angered Western fossil fuel corporations and, of course, US politicians who were funded by big oil corporations, so they launched this coup. And what this demonstrates is how the oil industry has always been extremely political. You cannot understand the global oil market without understanding geopolitics. And today I'm going to explain how Iran, ever since the revolution in 1979, has understood the power of oil and has used oil as a geopolitical tool to challenge the United States. Now, Iran is a major country. It has more than 90 million people, and it's one of the leading producers of both oil and natural gas. And the Iranian government has used its position in the global oil and gas market to push de-dollarization, to challenge the dominance of the US dollar, and to challenge US political dominance overall. Iran's late former president, Ibrahim Raisi, spelled this out very clearly. He called on countries in the global south to trade in their own local currencies, not the US dollar. And he said, quote, "The hegemony of the Western world contributes to the hegemony of the dollar. In order to create a new economic order, it is necessary to remove this instrument of hegemony in world practice, to use national currencies in settlements between countries," end quote. In 2024, Iran officially became a full member of BRICS, and Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei said that BRICS should be a platform for global de-dollarization. Khamenei said that global South countries are much too dependent on the US dollar, which reinforces US hegemony. And he said, quote, "The purpose is for BRICS members to omit the US dollar from trade exchange as far as possible. That would be a great and important job," end quote. The Iranian government even said that it would support the creation of a new BRICS currency to settle trade imbalances globally. Although, again, this is going to be a long and complicated process. It's still in the early stages and is only being debated and discussed. It hasn't broken ground yet. But in the short term, Iran and other BRICS countries are already de-dollarizing their international trade by using local currencies, national currencies, in trade with their bilateral trade partners. So for instance, Iran and Russia have de-dollarized nearly all of their bilateral trade. Moreover, Iran and fellow BRICS member India have been working on de-dollarizing their bilateral trade. So Iran has been selling oil and gas to India, and they've been settling their trade using the Iranian rial and the Indian rupee, cutting out the US dollar. So India can export agricultural goods to Iran, and basically what they're doing is Iran is exchanging its oil for those Indian agricultural goods. And the biggest trading partner of Iran is China. China is the world's largest importer of oil. It's a manufacturing superpower. It has 1.4 billion people. It needs a lot of energy. And China has become the number one purchaser of Iranian oil. And China has been paying for that oil not with US dollars, but with China's own currency, the renminbi, also known as the yuan. This has allowed Iran and China to circumvent unilateral Western sanctions. The US has imposed very aggressive sanctions on Iran and also some on China. These sanctions violate international law because they don't have the endorsement of the UN Security Council, but it has devastated Iran's economy. So Iran is constantly trying to find ways around the US-dominated financial system, which has only further incentivized it to seek alternatives to the US dollar and to support a global movement that is growing of de-dollarization. And Iran is a significant player in global energy markets. Iran is tied with Iraq and China as the 5th largest producer of oil on Earth. And Iran is the world's number 3 producer of natural gas. And what the US is really concerned about is that other countries in the Persian Gulf may start doing exactly what Iran is doing and sell their oil and gas in other currencies, not in the US dollar. In fact, this is already happening. The United Arab Emirates has been selling liquefied natural gas, LNG, to China in yuan, not in dollars. And Saudi Arabia, which has historically been one of the most important oil producers on earth, even Saudi Arabia is also in talks with China about selling its oil in China's currency, the yuan, which would be a massive blow to the US petrodollar system. What is the petrodollar system? Well, in order to understand this, we have to go back to August 1971, when US President Richard Nixon ended the convertibility of the dollar to gold. Because before that, going to the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 at the end of World War II, the US dollar had been pegged to gold at a fixed exchange rate of $35 for 1 ounce of gold. Nixon ended that, and since 1971, the US dollar has been a freely floating fiat currency. This means that the value of the US dollar in relation to other currencies is constantly fluctuating up and down in the foreign exchange market. And in the 1970s, there was a lot of inflation in the United States, and the US was trying to find a way to stabilize the value of the dollar to bring down inflation. This is especially after the OPEC oil embargo in 1973, which caused oil prices to skyrocket. And in 1974, inflation in the US hit 11%, which was record-breaking at the time. In 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, launched an oil embargo on the US and its Western allies because of their support for Israel, which was illegally occupying Palestinian, Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian territory. Let's not forget this was a very revolutionary period in the 70s, and there were anti-colonial national liberation struggles happening around the world. So the Global South came together and used its power in the global oil market to use oil as a geopolitical weapon against the Western colonial powers. And this embargo immediately caused the price of oil to more than double. And then in the subsequent years, throughout all of the geopolitical turbulence, between 1973 and 1981, the price of oil increased by 5 times. This was a massive crisis. And this was a very significant reason for the sky-high rates of inflation in the US and in many other countries around the world in the 1970s. And by the way, a year and a half after the OPEC oil embargo, the leader of that embargo was assassinated. He was King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, and he had been very pro-Palestine and was very angry at Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory and also occupation of the territory of other neighboring Arab countries. So he is the one who, as the king of Saudi Arabia, which at the time was the de facto leader of OPEC, he oversaw the OPEC oil embargo, and a year and a half later, he was assassinated. But regardless, the point is that the OPEC oil embargo was a major wake-up call to the Western imperialist countries that colonized most of the world. It showed them that the Global South, which produced the majority of the oil in the world, could unite And through OPEC, they could use their influence in the global oil industry to do significant damage to the economies of the West. So, in 1974, a year after the OPEC oil embargo, the Richard Nixon administration made a plan to create the petrodollar system. And what happened? In 1974, Nixon sent the U.S. Treasury Secretary Bill Simon, to Saudi Arabia to make a deal. This is how Bloomberg described their goal. Quote, neutralize crude oil as an economic weapon and find a way to persuade a hostile kingdom, that is Saudi Arabia, to finance America's widening deficit with its newfound petrodollar wealth, end quote. And Nixon made it clear there was no coming back empty-handed. Now, this strategy was not only crafted by Nixon, but also by Nixon's all-powerful Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger. So Kissinger and Nixon sent the Treasury Secretary, Bill Simon, to Saudi Arabia. Who was William Simon? He was a Wall Street veteran who had served as the head of the Treasury's desk, bond trading, for the major Wall Street investment bank, Salomon Brothers. And in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in 1974, this is the deal he made with the Saudis. I'm reading here from Bloomberg. Quote, Simon, better than anyone else, understood the appeal of U.S. government debt and how to sell the Saudis on the idea that America was the safest place to park their petrodollars, end quote. And then later on, quote, the basic framework was strikingly simple. The U.S. would buy oil from Saudi Arabia and provide the kingdom military aid and equipment. In return, the Saudis would plow billions of their petrodollar revenue back into treasuries and finance America's spending, end quote. This was famously spelled out by the economist Michael Hudson, a good friend of the show, back in his book, Super Imperialism, The Economic Strategy of American Empire. He explained how with the war in Korea and then the U.S. war on Vietnam, the U.S. began running a larger and larger current account deficit. That is a balance of payments deficit. The U.S. was importing more and more and exporting less and less. And Michael Hudson explained with all of the data proving that the reason for that was because of the U.S. empire, the wars it was waging around the world. The balance of payments deficit was due to the U.S. military's global spending to maintain this empire with foreign military bases all around the world. So after Nixon ended the link of the U.S. dollar to gold, the way that he maintained global demand for the U.S. dollar was to force the Persian Gulf monarchies, especially Saudi Arabia, but then later the UAE and Qatar and others, to sell their oil and gas in US dollars, which means that countries all around the world that need to import oil and gas have to get access to dollars. This maintains global demand for the US dollar, and it has allowed the US to run larger and larger current account deficits, trade deficits with the rest of the world over decades, and yet most countries would face a severe currency crisis if this happened. Their currency would fall significantly against the dollar and they would have hyperinflation. The reason it doesn't happen in the US is because there's global demand for the US dollar because countries need the dollar in order to pay for imports, not only of oil and gas, but many other commodities and other imports because the dollar is the global reserve currency. And also because other countries that have current account surpluses, trade surpluses with the rest of the world, they recycle the excess dollars they get from trade into U.S. government debt, U.S. Treasury securities, and other U.S. assets. So at the heart of the exorbitant privilege that the U.S. has by printing global reserve currency, the heart of that exorbitant privilege is the petrodollar system, and especially the Persian Gulf monarchies selling their oil and gas in dollars. So the fact that Iran and the UAE are already selling oil and gas to China in yuan is very concerning from the perspective of the US empire. And Washington is especially afraid of the possibility of Saudi Arabia doing the same. Now, Saudi Arabia still plays a very influential role in the global oil market as a swing producer. because Saudi Arabia's state-owned oil company, Saudi Aramco, is known to be used as a political tool. When Riyadh wants to accomplish a certain goal, it can increase or reduce its oil production in order to influence the price of oil on the global market. And Saudi Arabia is still a major player in OPEC. So the US is very concerned about the possibility of Saudi Arabia moving away from the petrodollar and potentially toward a petroyuan, or at the very least, selling its oil in different currencies with different trading partners. In fact, back in 2023, the Wall Street Journal published an article that outlined the demands that the Biden administration had imposed on Saudi Arabia as part of a plan to broker rapprochement with Israel. The US was pressuring Saudi Arabia to officially recognize Israel and to abandon the Palestinians. And according to this report, the US government had two main demands. One, Saudi Arabia had to cut its close ties with China. And two, Saudi Arabia had to give assurances that it will sell its oil in dollars, not the Chinese currency, the yuan. The Wall Street Journal wrote that, quote, the Biden administration is seeking assurances from Saudi Arabia that it will distance itself economically and militarily from China. Officials said the U.S. could seek assurances from Saudi Arabia that it won't allow China to build military bases in the kingdom. Negotiators could also seek limitations on Saudi Arabia using technology developed by China's Huawei and assurances that Riyadh will use U.S. dollars, not Chinese currency, to price oil sales, end quote. If you want more information about this, I have another video and an article specifically about this topic, which I will link to in the description below. But the point to take away is that the US is waging war on Iran as a threat to other countries in the region, telling them that if you act too independently like Iran, if you get too close to China and Russia, if you sell your oil and gas in other currencies and challenge the petrodollar, you will face consequences. The US is punishing Iran, waging war on Iran, and saying to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, which have historically been US client regimes like Iran was before the revolution in 1979 under the Shah, the US is telling them, do not try to copy what Iran is doing, or you will be the next Iran. So I think all of this context is very important to understand why the United States has been so desperate to carry out regime change in Iran. In fact, President Donald Trump admitted that the goal is regime change, overthrowing the revolutionary government in Tehran. Now, this is not unique to Trump. This has been bipartisan policy for decades. And again, one of those reasons, a significant reason, is because Iran has been a significant voice in the global South, pushing for alternatives to U.S. imperial hegemony, challenging the U.S. empire, and in particular, challenging the U.S.-dominated financial system. And the heart of that U.S.-dominated financial system is the dollar, which guarantees this exorbitant privilege that has enriched capitalist elites in the US who have become billionaires. And they do not want this system to change because it benefits them. So I'm not saying this is the only reason why the US is trying to carry out regime change in Iran. There are many other factors. And if you want to learn about the other reasons and the rest of the historical context here, in the description below, I will link to another long video that I did explaining the reasons why the US wants regime change in Iran. But on that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.